have come tonight to meet Kerry James Marshall. He's one of the most celebrated painters in the US, and we are grateful to have him here visiting us. We're also very grateful to have his artwork in the permanent collection. The painting is called Our Town. Kerry James Marshall is a graduate of the Otis College of Art and Design and currently lives and works in Chicago. He recently completed a solo exhibition at the National Gallery of Art in 2013. If you haven't heard of Kerry, I encourage you to go to any major institution, art museum in the country and around the world, and you will find an artwork of Kerry James Marshall. Particularly the painting Our Town has helped the museum here, our educators, to teach visiting school children on important topics to Kerry, which is the experience of African Americans and the narrative of American history that has excluded Black people. And so he's here to share that story and talk about that discussion within history. As we've gotten to know the artists in the State of the Art exhibition, mentorship and finding a positive influence has become a popular message throughout this new exhibition. Interestingly, Kerry is a focal point in our permanent collection. However, it's come full circle with the new exhibition that features one of his previous students, Mequitta Ahuja. And Mequitta is here tonight. We've actually asked her to come and do a very special introduction for her mentor, Kerry. Welcome up.
The lessons I learned from Kerry echo in my mind daily when I'm in the studio. Kerry was my advisor in graduate school, and he once wrote that I was an ideal student. So in order to maintain my reputation, I've done a little homework. I assembled a list of 5 of the key ideas that I learned from Kerry. Number 1, work at museum scale. Work to the outer limits of your space. This pertains to all of the resources in the studio. We must strategically use what we have. Number 2, a work must succeed on all levels to be successful, to the art initiated as well as to the general public. Kerry's work expands the canon. He uses the lens of art history to look at contemporary subjects. For a work to succeed, it must have many doors of entry. Number 3, don't use your materials to make your imagery through the way that you use your materials. This speaks to Kerry's mastery of form. He's calling for a rigorous investment in one's techniques and materials. Number 4, have a clear objective. When making a work, just do one thing. Kerry asks his students to consider what the single gesture alone can do, to distill our ideas and only include the necessary. And number 5, the ideal position from which to work is as a drunken master. Once you've gained mastery, loosen up. Like a jazz musician, improvisation embodies both skill and chance. So as you can see, Kerry has great clarity of thought and is incredibly generous in sharing his ideas. I feel so lucky to have had Kerry as my teacher, and one of the things that motivates me is wanting to make good on the time and investment of insights that Kerry's made on me. I feel so honored to have this moment. Please join me in welcoming Kerry James Marshall.
Oh. All right. I have to give you a hug. Oh. Ooh. So what a few well-placed comments won't do. Well, thank you, Ahuja. Mequitta, see, I'm flustered now because I don't know how to respond to that. But thank you so much for that introduction. And I have to thank Crystal Bridges for first acquiring the work and having it on display, but also for the invitation to come down to Arkansas from Chicago and talk about what I'm doing. This is my first trip to Bentonville, first trip to Crystal Bridges, and it's everything they said it was supposed to be. Really, I mean, this place really is spectacular. I mean, you have no idea how lucky you are to have a museum that sort of comes on the scene and really is up to speed almost instantly. I mean, this is like, I was saying to Sarah who works, this is like 0 to 60 in instant acceleration, because this is like the things that are in this collection are just spectacular. I mean, it's so rare to be able to see work of such quality in one single place. And for Crystal Bridges to have the collection of works they have is just a remarkable achievement. So this is something that you all should be quite grateful and thankful for, because it's out of the ordinary. And so, I mean, if we'll pick up on some of the things Mequitta said. I mean, in a lot of ways, this is where I always wanted to end up. You know, my whole objective as an artist was to end up in places like this, to have my work in collections like this, and to be in collections amongst the whole pantheon of other really remarkable artists who have work in museum collections. I mean, that's really what it's all about in a lot of ways. I mean, it's at once, yes, about satisfying yourself, you know, and doing things that you are interested in and that you can be proud of yourself for having done. But really, that satisfaction isn't really fulfilled until you find yourself in the company of other people who've done incredible and amazing things too. I mean, that's where your success is really ratified, you know, by your presence there. And once you realize you're a part of that club and that you've achieved all those things you set out to achieve, then you can sort of sit back and say, I've actually done something, you know. And so that's a part of my story. And through the works that I'm going to show, I'm going to talk a lot about what my perception of what it means to be an artist was when I started out, and what my perception of what I think it means to be an artist in the 21st century is. And then through the work that I show, you're going to see just in a way how I engage with the idea of what it means to be an artist, and then how I think it's possible to establish a meaningful relationship with the history of art, so that your work has, as I always say, you got to have a better than 50-50 chance that you're going to get what you want out of doing it when you set out. Because I've always been sort of about not, as I heard Mequitta say earlier, making yourself sort of invulnerable, because you can't leave yourself at the mercy of people who are out there who claim to know more about what you're doing than you do, and who may not have your best interest at heart. And so you got to figure, if you want to be a part of an institution or a system or in a game, you got to figure out what it takes to get to the top of the game, and you got to be able to do that on your terms. And your terms have to be terms that mesh with the terms of the people who are already controlling the dynamics of whatever that field is. And so, and for me, I don't think it's such a difficult thing to achieve, because I think it seems fairly clear from the literature of art history what the objectives should be if you want to be included in that narrative. Now, I can't say that I can guarantee that I will achieve the kind of status that I want, but at least I think I've got a better than 50% chance of getting part the way there. And to a degree, that's kind of good enough. Our town, we'll get to that a little later. But what I want to start with is a fairly new picture, but not a great slide of it because this was a slide that I had to take of a picture before I shipped it off for an exhibition I just had that opened in London in October. And for the exhibition in London at the David Zwirner Gallery, the title of the show is Look, See. And so this is the first picture you see when you walk in the room. And it's as a part of that strategic approach to making artworks and presenting them to the public, I mean, you sort of set up a kind of a surprise. I mean, you kind of undercut people's expectations sometimes because you don't want them to always be too familiar and expect to see exactly what they expect to see every time they go to see a show of yours. So when you walk into the gallery, this is the first thing you see. And it's a painting from a group of works that I'm doing that are based on ink blots, you know, the Rorschach blot. But in a way in which you could do a thing that's based on a Rorschach blot without being a Rorschach blot. And so in this case, this is 3 Rorschachs stacked on top of each other, and then sort of scanned into a computer and then doubled and flipped. So it's like 6 Rorschach blocks on top of each other. And then I made the painting. So the painting is not a Rorschach block because a Rorschach is a phenomena. You know, it's a thing that happens when you execute a certain process, you fold that paper in half, and you end up with a Rorschach. And they almost always come out looking pretty much the same. So, but if you want to get away from that similarity, if you want to start to impose your will on the Rorschach, then you start filtering it through some other expectations that you'd like to have. And one of the expectations I had when I was making these works is I didn't want the work as a Rorschach to make available to the person who was seeing it any of the anthropomorphic kinds of readings that people are likely to read into Rorschachs when they see them. Because a Rorschach, by definition, is an invitation to see what you want to see, or to see what you're able to see based on what the information there is. And so how do you render a Rorschach more abstract than an abstraction? But then not be an abstraction at all because it's a representation of what a Rorschach is supposed to be. Because it's painted. Every one of those marks, every one of those shapes, every one of those things is painted directly. So none of those things happen by accident. And so so in a way, this sort of encapsulates the way I see what I do as an artist. I'm not particularly interested in accidents per se, although when you're making work, accidents do happen. And then but what you really want is the kind of clarity that allows you to capitalize on the accidents that have value and then weed out and winnow out the accidents that don't add anything of any real value to the picture that you're making. So that you're in complete control at all times, so that you're never, even if you're improvising, improvisation only works when you know where all of the notes on the instrument are. And so that's my approach. And so I set this painting up to begin the exhibition, and then from there it goes on to things that people find are a lot more familiar. But that also began to dovetail with the history of image making and the history of representation. And so that first painting, the Rorschach painting, is 7 foot by 10 foot. And this is the same size as that painting, but of course a very different painting. So between those two, and both those two paintings are the same size, and everything else in the show is a different size. So, but these two paintings sort of set the framework for how you are supposed to look at the exhibition, because they are both about the way in which images come to be made. And so this is a big part of my activity as an artist. So I have a lot of stuff to show, and I'm going to try to go through the things in such a way where I can hit on some touchstones or some milestones in my development and my thinking. But in the process, you're going to see a lot of different kinds of things, and then I'll tell you some things about what those different kinds of things mean in terms of what my objective is. So anyway, this is, I'm going to give a couple of titles, but I'm not going to really give titles to everything, but some of the things I'm just going to let you look at. Just look at that. And we'll get to some of those things. So this is the show that was in London. So you're getting a look at the show in London without having to go there. And then when I get through the rest of them, I'll tell you something about why I made the choices that I made. So a kind of pattern starts to emerge from the exhibition. And so if you take that plus the title of the show, Look, See, then you start to get a sense that everything is about looking or presenting oneself to be seen, voyeurism and display. I mean, everything is about that in one way or another. Either the subjects in the picture are looking, or the subjects in the picture are presenting themselves to be looked at, or the subjects in the pictures are being spied on by people who they are unaware are looking at them, or the subjects are in the picture and they have a complete disregard for the spectator who looks at the picture. So all of those different ways in which the idea of looking and presenting can be disposed is what that show is largely about. And part of another thing that happens with these works in this show, as opposed to the way the work like Our Town operates, is that in these works, I mean, there's, on some level, you could say nothing happens. I mean, there's nothing going on. There's no, in a lot of them, there's no backstory. So there's a way in which some of these works are associated with a historical reality and some of them are not. And some of them represent a kind of normalized presentation of a black figure that is not associated with any kind of relationship to history, but that it establishes a presence for that figure, which I think is meaningful in its own right, independent of its relationship to history. So if we look at the Our Town painting, I mean, there are a lot of things you can read into that painting that have a lot to do with the kind of cultural dynamics of American history and American culture, and the place of the black figure in that cultural and historical frame. But at a certain point, I mean, if you deal with the complexity of being, meaning the way in which people sort of exist in the world on existential terms, then a good part of what people are doing in the world is just being in the world. They're not associated with, or not engaged in, or not active around anything in particular. They are just there. And there's something about the just being there-ness, to coin a word. It's like being there-ness is a really important function of the figure in a picture too. Simply being there and being able to be seen. And so when I make works, I do all those things. You know, from time to time, I do work that is specifically rooted in a very particular historical moment or a particular historical phenomena. And there's work that's about very particular characters or individuals who have a presence in history, but of whom there are no visual representations. So I make works like that too. And then I make works that are about moments in history, and we'll see some of those things later. But then there are moments in which I make pictures of people that are just about them being in a picture, so that they are available to be looked at. Because as we'll get to in a moment, one of the challenges of making work in a rich visual field is that environment is a hyper-competitive environment. And what's actually happening in the world of representation is that there are people who are projecting their ideal vision of what loveliness is and what objects of desire are into the visual field, and everybody who who can't do that in one way or another has to adjust their relationship to the idea of somebody else's projection of what's ideal in the world. And so as an artist, as a person who makes images myself, I think one of my responsibilities is to make work that does that same thing, so that you can't surrender the field of representation to a single source of image production that tends to dominate the field of representation. It dominates the idea of desire. And so my thing is that if you have the capacity to make images yourself, then you got to be projecting images into that field too that do the same thing. And so that's a part of what I'm also trying to do with the work that I make. Now, this particular work, and then there's another one that follows, it's about these sort of moments of on one hand, I'd say adulation. There's a picture called The Crowning Moment. But people are always sort of curious about that headdress on the figure. Nobody really knew what it was like, but it's very specific. And this is where things become very specific in works that I do. They refer to something that has a historical reality that a lot of people might not be familiar with, but once you know it, then all of a sudden the implications of that start to come together and create a frame of thinking that allows you to consider the implications of the existence of this particular picture. So this is that's a small version. This is the companion piece to it, which is a bigger picture, but with that same crown. And here's where the crown comes from. Oh. I would say, how'd that get in there? So here, I'm shameless about I'll take some Beyonce credit where I can get it. So with Beyonce and Jay-Z came to see the show, and my wife Cheryl standing there with me. But anyway, I thought I was going to show this next thing. So that crown comes to, this is Gloria Smith, who was the second Miss Black America in 1969. And you know, it's like as late as 1969, you know, black women couldn't be in the Miss America pageant. And so a pageant was established, a parallel pageant was established for the Miss Black America pageant. And it was originally supposed to happen the next day after the Miss America pageant at the same venue in Atlantic City. So that was how it was, that's how the Miss Black America pageant started. And so anyway, and that's the crown they used in the Miss Black America pageant. So you see, so that's a way in which the work sort of moves in and out of a relationship to history. And it does so often by including very specific artifacts of history that when you're doing some study and some research, you might come across some of these things. And what I intend in my work is for these things to be triggers of a sort. You know, on the one, the unfamiliarity with some of those aspects of it, I hope are provocative enough so that people might want to go and find out, well, what was that thing? You know. And once you find out that thing, then a whole other series of things start to open up. But back to the idea of looking, you know, where the subject sort of looks at itself, you know, at the same time that the spectator sort of looks at the picture. I mean, there are all of these sort of exchanges that become a part of what it means to look and to make. And so when I put an array of works like this in my slide presentation, in part because there are a series of questions that have to be asked. First, by people who mean to participate, in the profession of making images. But they're also, these are images that also have to be taken into account by anybody who feels like there's, for some reason, whatever they're doing is not good enough to be a part of what museums present as the best that can be made. And so that's really what that's what museums do on the one hand. They present to the public what somebody's judgment has said are the best things that can be made, and things that are worth being seen because they are the best things that can be made. This is why the Metropolitan Museum is what it is, why the Museum of Modern Art is what it is. If you go to the Louvre, if you go to the Uffizi, if you go to any of those museums, that represents what's supposed to be the pinnacle of success. But if you don't find yourself in those museums, especially through a large part of those collections, then you have a series of questions about yourself and your capacity to make things that you have to resolve on one level or another. And so when I put works like these in, and these are works from all different kinds of cultures, from a lot of different kinds of time. I mean, there are things that are as old as, if you take some of the rock paintings and glyphs, some of those things are 30,000 years old. There are paintings, there are things from Egypt, there are things from Mexico, there are things from China, there are things from the Middle East, there are things from Greece, there are things from Africa. And these are things that are all over 2,000 to 3,000 years old. And so what those objects tell us when we see them is that the capacity to make fantastic and amazing things is something that is worldwide, universal, that all kinds of people have the capacity to do that. So it's not about, so we're never really having a conversation about the capacity of people to make those kinds of things. When we're talking about art history, we're talking about a structure that privileges some things over other things, and that privileges some narratives over other kinds of narratives. And the narrative that this kind of an art history privileges is a narrative of progress and a narrative of modernity. And it says, by what's in these books, it says who has the capacity to be modern, to create modern, to invent themselves as modern. That's what this art history is telling us. And when you, for African American artists, for Mexican artists, for Chinese artists, for Native American artists, for all these other artists who you see in those sections of the book that are about the ancient arts, the Chinese art, the primitive arts, what people call the African arts, all those things, what those people find out from looking at books like this, is, as I was saying to somebody else earlier, that all their best stuff was the ancient stuff. And after about 2000 BC, they didn't do nothing else that anybody was interested in. Because they don't show up in these narratives again until the late 20th century. And when they don't show up in those narratives until the late 20th century, then you have to assume that they couldn't have done anything over the last 600 years that was worth looking at or thinking about or talking about, because nobody was writing about it. And especially nobody who mattered seemed to be writing about it. And so when we look at art history, this is what we expect to see when we look at art history. That's the art history everybody learns. I learned it. Everybody else learns it. And that art history has meaning. But what it also does is it keeps everybody else seeking to be a part of this narrative, because it's a magnificent narrative. I mean, in that record, those are incredible works. Those artists are amazing artists. And you can't deny that they did wonderful things. But if somehow or other your people never seem to match that, and certainly not match it in a way that anybody who's writing these histories thinks is worth putting in these books, then you got an issue you got to deal with. And this is the thing. This is the thing that's one part of everything I have to consider when I am making a picture. there's no way I can make a work and not have the existence of all of this and the importance of all of this in the back of my mind. I just can't. Nobody could. And so, you know, I like those books too. You know, I have a lot of them. And I refer to them all the time. Not because I'm looking for things to copy from them per se, but what I'm looking at them for primarily is to understand what the logic is that controls access to those books. You know, what is it about the work that's in there that is so exceptional that it completely displaces the possibility of a lot of other things being in there? And what does it mean if there are artists who I admire, who are heroes of mine, who I think do magnificent work, but their work doesn't show up in there? What does that mean? You know, I have to have an answer for that question, because if I don't have an answer for it, I can't proceed. And so I take all of those books. The latest one of them is that Art Since 1900, which goes all the way from 1900 up to the present, which is the moment of modernity when it comes to art history, even though sort of modernism in art sort of started, you know, maybe about 20, 30 years before then. But the moment of modernism is that turn of the century where the game at that point was completely changed. And for lack of a better term, I would say the price of the ticket for getting in there was very different from what it was pre-Manet, you could say. But and then you take the book The American Century, which was a part of an exhibition, a series of exhibitions they did at the Whitney Museum of American Art. So that section of it, from the first part of it was 1900 to 1950, and then the second part was 1950 to 2000. And just looking at even the way the idea of art for that period is sort of, the narrative of art for that period is structured, was really interesting, because there's one page in that book that I found really striking, and it's a page that sort of talked about the way in which the art world was changing, and changing so much that at a moment in the late 60s and the early 70s, the art world sort of embraced this capacity to engage the work of women and people of color, including artists like Norman Lewis and Romare Bearden. And then that's the only mention of any of those artists in that book. There's not even a picture of their work in there. And so it comes into the narrative in a way in which the art world is sort of starting to now embrace this thing called ethnicity and identity politics. Not on the value of the work, but simply because it's now found this capacity to kind of open up to artists who had been formerly marginalized. And now that also means something. Because those artists, I mean, Romare Bearden in particular was an artist that I admired when I was a young person sort of thinking about what it means to be an artist. And there was a great article on Romare Bearden in Ebony magazine that I still have to this day, that I clipped from the magazine back when it came out in the early 70s. But but this is all a part of the kind of the kind of frame of reference that I have to use in order to make the work that I'm doing. And so I mentioned Romare Bearden, and it's important that Norman Lewis's name sort of was a part of that narrative, because if you know, Norman Lewis was a black painter who started doing abstract work in the 1940s, was a friend of Ad Reinhardt's and a lot of other artists who used to hang out in New York at the Cedar Bar. You know, that second generation of abstract expressionist artists. He used to hang out with them. But the big complaint around Norman Lewis is that even though Norman Lewis was at all those meetings, that he was friends with a lot of those artists, when the narrative of New York School abstract painting was written, they never mentioned that Norman Lewis was even a part of it. And so people wonder, whether or not, what the reasons why Norman Lewis's work is sort of left out of the narrative, because he was the only black person sort of sitting at the table. There are a couple of photographs of him with some of the people. And the thing is that Norman Lewis started making, like a number of African American artists, and like Norman Lewis, started making abstract work because they thought that might be the strategy they could use to get into the mainstream without being black, without the fact that they are black costing them their access to the art world. So that if I'm a black person, if I don't make a work that has black people in it, then nobody will think that I'm a black person. Because they don't have to, if they don't see me and they just see the work, then they'll evaluate the work on the aesthetic terms that I want them to evaluate it on. They won't think about who I am while they're thinking about what the work means. But unfortunately, for a lot of those artists, that was a failed strategy too, because they still ended up on the outside of the narrative of art. And it's like, if you take all of those books that I had on the screen before, not a single mention of any of those artists in any of those books. So my position is, well, that if that's going to be the case on some level, you know, you better just go for it. And let's go for it with the black figure, because the black figure actually has the greater capacity of changing people's expectations when they go to the museum than any number of abstract works that anybody can make at any time. Because it's the least familiar thing you encounter when you go to the art museum. And because of that lack of familiarity, it has the greatest capacity to transform your expectations when you go in there. And so that's one of the reasons why I make so many of the kinds of works that I make. Now, the other thing about Norman Lewis that I think is really important has a lot to do with this photograph. You know, Norman Lewis, he wasn't an astronaut. But the abstraction that Norman Lewis was doing has something to do with the way astronauts after this moment are considered when we think about what it means to achieve some great thing in space exploration. And so, I structured this thing. There are two things that I think about a lot. So one was the Norman Lewis paradox, and the other is the Mae Jemison paradox. Now, most people know who Dr. Mae Jemison was, right? Right? Well, so here, Mae Jemison was she's the first black woman to fly on the space shuttle, on a space shuttle mission. And so, like Sally Ride, you know, the first school teacher to fly on a space shuttle mission. And while on some level those seem like remarkable things and great achievements, I mean, if you put it all in perspective and you look at it in relationship to other kinds of achievement in that field, those things are meaningless. You know, yes, it's an accomplishment to get to be on a space mission on a space shuttle. But by comparison, it's like this picture, these are 12 men who walked on the moon. So, I mean, if you're looking at achievements in terms of what the value of those achievements, I think that's a bigger thing to me than doing any kind of experiments or projects while you're riding on the space shuttle. The space shuttle itself is the phenomenal achievement because it's the reuse space vehicle that you can fly into the Earth's atmosphere like an airplane, as opposed to having to crash land in the water or on the ground somewhere in Siberia, like the Soyuz capsules do. So if you're thinking in terms of the way the space program and physics and engineering operate, and today it's like, I don't know if they landed that probe on the comet that was going by, did it hook on? So, I mean, come on. Let's talk about achievement. That's an achievement. Those are achievements because those things are hard to do. And they're things that hadn't been done before then. So if you take that same kind of relationship to achievement in the space program or in physics or something like that, and you put that in the art world, well, what's the equivalent? And so I think, so artists have to think about the equivalency of what they're doing in relationship to those kinds of things too. So that if you start out making abstract paintings in 1970, and you look back at the historical record and you see that in 1914, or 1910, or 1911, or 1909, that people had already gone fully abstract in 1911, then making an abstract painting in 1970 is not that big a deal. It can be a good painting. But what you understand if you read art history is that the question about whether or not abstraction had a real meaningful value, that was already over by 1960. They weren't having that conversation anymore. And so if you're going to start out making that your way to get in, then you're already starting out so far behind that it doesn't make a lot of sense. And that if you don't end up in some of those narratives, well then, I mean, can you understand why? And I think people have to approach everything like that. So that if you're not bringing something if you're not bringing something in there that is different enough so that those pictures don't look like any of the other pictures that you would see when you go to the museum, then don't even bother on some level. I mean, unless all you want to do is sell some pictures. If you just want to sell some pictures, you might fish around them long enough and find the kind of model where people might find it either innocuous enough or decorative enough, you know, to function in the marketplace, where you see, if you look at the way the marketplace, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of pictures being made by a lot of people all the time. I mean, all you have to do is collect 1 year's worth of catalogs from Sotheby's and Christie's, and you look at the amount of stuff that's circulating through the art market, most of which most people never see, and most of it that never gets written about, most of it that only has a value because of the way it's able to circulate through the marketplace, then you get some sense of what the differential objectives of artists can be. You know, there are the artists who, like Roy Lichtenstein, you say, well, why would Roy Lichtenstein go from making abstract paintings to doing cartoons? And his answer was, because there was no space for me between Milton Resnick and all the other second-generation abstract painters who were working at the time. If your work just simply fits into that kind of paradigm and looks just like, it's about like everything everybody else is doing, then you ain't got a chance. So why would you keep doing something like that? Because if you think about what artists do, I mean, one of the reasons artists make work on one level is because they like making pictures, but they also want to call attention to themselves. Because you have to find, like Roy Lichtenstein says, you have to find a place for you in a world in which there are all these other people who are making work ahead of you. You got to figure out how to distinguish yourself distinguish your work on site from what they're doing, and at the same time try to advance an idea about what kinds of things can or can't be pictures, or can or can't be paintings. And you get a sense of the ambition that artists have when you read what artists themselves have to say about what they're doing. And the Andy Warhol, there's an article in American Heritage magazine of all places, so you can find interesting things about art in the unlikeliest places. There's a great issue of American Heritage magazine. There's an article called How Pop Turned the Art World Upside Down. And it's a history of the first 4 years of pop art, and when the first exhibition that Henry Geldzahler did at the Museum of Modern Art, and how those artists, Roy Lichtenstein, Andy Warhol, Clay Zoldenberg, and James Rosenquist, how those artists sort of helped establish the kind of pop art as a kind of paradigm shift. And there's a couple of interesting narratives in there, and one of them is a narrative that sort of demonstrates how a changing of the guard took place, where Henry Geldzahler had a party at his apartment for the pop artists after that show, and Willem de Kooning showed up uninvited, and they slammed the door in his face. So that's a paradigm shift, you know. But Andy Warhol and Roy Lichtenstein, Andy Warhol, he said he was making comic book paintings too. I know you saw those Dick Tracy paintings he had done and some of the Superman paintings and stuff. And so Warhol asked, he says, well, when I saw Roy Lichtenstein's comic book paintings, I knew they were much better than mine. And I realized I had to go in another direction, a direction in which I would come out first. That says something about the way artists see themselves in relationship to each other. And it says something about how competitive the environment that artists are operating in is. And the way I see it, if you're not taking that into account, I mean, if you're really not trying to find a way to make something that is different, then you, I mean, and I don't mean different just because it's novel. I mean, it has to be meaningfully different. I mean, it has to be a kind of, really a kind of challenge to the way people perceive things and the way what people expect to see when they go to the museum to see artworks. So anyway, those are, and here's the interesting thing, is like, you can't find probably 3 people who can name those 12 men who walked on the moon. And yet we know a lot about people who do fairly meaningless things. So, but you know, this is the conundrum. But anyway, so this is where it started for me. Because I started out doing what everybody who goes to art school does. I mean, for a period you do still lives and you do, you know, the kind of conventional pictures and things like that. And for a long time I did collages, and you're going to see some of those after this. But I had started doing abstract collages for a period. And I got a review in the LA Times, which was the wake-up call that I think everybody deserves to have. And this is what it said. And I'll tell you who the critic was, too, in case you want to hunt her down. No, I'm just kidding. But here's the thing. So Suzanne Munchnick. But so anyway, so I was in an exhibition with these little abstract collages. They were mixed media. And so she says, oh, it's collages by Kerry Marshall. So they're nice compositions, really attractive colors, and blah, blah, all of these things. But they fade into masses of other things that look just like them. And that's the best, that's music to your ears. Really, because if you don't wake up when you get something like that, and the thing is, like, and when you look at it, you see it and you know it. You know it too. But if you don't respond to that, you keep going in the same direction you're going in, you feel like all you want to do is make some nice pictures, then you kind of have to take what you get. And so, but for me, I mean, I had done those collages for a while, but I could tell even while I was making them that when you're making works like those, these sort of mixed media, there's a kind of a cliche of mixed media abstraction, where if you push the paint around and some shapes around long enough, they'll eventually fall into a configuration that you can kind of get satisfied with. You know, you don't have to be all that intelligent to make an abstract painting. Oh. Well, it's true. It's true. And when you look at pictures, you can tell what the work is about when you look at it and what it's trying to do. So anyway, but after I got to that point where I could see it's like, you know what, if I work on these for 2 or 3 hours or something like this, it's going to come out all right. But is that enough? And that was the moment in which I sort of really understood that going in that direction and doing those abstract works just was not where, it's not going to get me where I wanted to go. Now, I learned a lot of valuable things while making that work, because when you're making abstract work, you learn a lot about surface. You can learn a lot about the way texture interacts with each other. You can learn a lot about the way shapes interact. You can learn a lot about all those kinds of things. And the thing is, like, and what you end up doing when you're working like that is you start to develop a series of habits that determine what the picture is going to look like, because your hand just moves a certain kind of way and your eye just sees a certain kind of thing, and that certain kind of thing is always appealing to you. And it's really hard to break out of that pattern unless you impose some external kind of limitation on you that forces you to do something different than you would do if you just let yourself go. And it's that external thing that you have to impose on yourself that makes all the difference in the world. Because that external thing is a series of problems that you think you need to solve. And the problems you need to solve, only problems that you need to solve because you mean to achieve a certain kind of effect or get a certain kind of result, or to move one step closer to some other thing you're trying to get to. That's what that external thing is really all about. And the external thing for me was to go back to figuration, but with another idea, with an idea that I didn't have before. And it's an idea that I didn't get until I was reading Ralph Ellison's book, The Invisible Man. And like a lot of other people, I grew up on horror movies. I was like a horror movie fan like you wouldn't believe. We'd stay up till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning waiting for the late horror show to come on television. And I saw there 2 things that had a profound impact on me, and both of them are in this picture. One was a movie I saw when I was about 11 or 12 called Mr. Sardonicus. It's a B-movie classic. If you haven't seen it, you should look for it. Because so that's where I learned the true meaning of irony from that movie. And it's not being ironic, but irony. And there's a feature in this picture that comes directly from that movie. The other thing was the Claude Rains version of H.G. Wells' Invisible Man, the movie, you know, and you see when Claude Rains in the movie takes his clothes off after he's had that chemical thing, and he's completely transparent. You can't see him when he takes his clothes off. So it's the Invisible Man. But in reading Ralph Ellison's book, Invisible Man, he describes the condition of invisibility in the prologue to that book as a psychological condition, not as a kind of physiological condition. And so it's not the condition of being transparent so that you can't be seen, but for black people, it was this notion that they weren't desired to be seen. And so there was a psychological impediment that blocked the perception of people being able to see them for what they were or who they were. That's how Ralph Ellison describes the condition of invisibility. And so I took that plus this element from the Mr. Sardonicus movie, and that made this picture. But this picture is also a result of having spent a lot of time analyzing and looking at Leonardo da Vinci paintings. It's a small painting called The Portrait of the Artist as a Shadow of His Former Self. And the things that are important about it in terms of the way it's made and the way it was structured is that it's made in egg tempera, which is a kind of 13th century painting technique. And I made that using this Cennini's treatise on egg tempera from the 13th, where he explains how to do it. I used that as a kind of handbook to make the picture, but also using the kind of compositional devices and structures that you would find if you analyzed and examined Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo and Raphael. If you examine those Renaissance paintings, there's a way in which those pictures are built on a structure. I used that to make that picture. And I used it in a really self-conscious kind of manner, where I was really trying to be exact about everything that I was doing, every move that I was going to make, but then made a figure that did what Ralph Ellison's figure did in Invisible Man, was the figure that was present and absent simultaneously. So it was alternately there and not there. And the way I achieved that was making a black figure against a black background, where if you change the color temperature of the black for a warm black against a cool black, that temperature change in the color was enough to create a perceptual difference so that you could alternately see the figure and then not see the figure. That's how I started with that. And it's that figure that led directly to the reason why I paint all of the other figures that I'm painting now. So that's how it all got started. And that picture ended up in there too. The early picture. And that was 1980. I finished school at Otis in 1978. And for people who know anything about what the climate was like in the mid-70s, especially in California, with the way conceptual art had finally taken over in the academy, if you have some idea what the climate was like at that time, then you have some idea what kinds of works people were expecting you to do. So anyway, now I'm going to go a little fast because I think I've been talking for a long time. And I got about 1,000 pictures to show. No, not quite. But anyway, so let me do this. This is a photograph that's a part of a constellation of pictures that I showed at the museum in Antwerp, Mequitta, where I met the guy sitting on the end of the second row right here, Dieter Rollestrater, who was the curator at Mequitta in Antwerp when they brought they organized a show of mine that catalog, Painting and Other Stuff, came from. That's the guy who organized that. What'd you say? So anyway, but let me show a lot of things. So, but I did a show in Vienna at the Vienna Secession, and that show was called Who's Afraid of Red, Black, and Green? And so that garage door has something to do with that too. And then a series of paintings, but the whole show was organized. So that's a particular painting, but the whole and that's a particular painting. But the whole show was organized around, that's another thing from something else. That's in Baltimore, as a matter of fact, called Ladder of Success. But this painting, so if you know Barnett Newman, Barnett Newman did a painting called Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow, and Blue? And it's a big color field painting in which the scale of the painting and the intensity of that color is large enough to completely envelop the spectator so that you sort of lose your sense of place in relationship to the picture. And so color field, that's what the idea of a color field painting was, that you would create this field of saturated color that would completely envelop the spectator. So in my inversion of that picture, was that I took that painting and I made 3 paintings that are exactly the same size as the Barnett Newman painting, and that they do all of the things that the Barnett Newman painting does, but they have imagery in them as opposed to just being a color field, and that the imagery that's in there has some political and social kind of cultural implication. And so there's a phrase in that picture. It's a red on red, but the phrase says "if they come in the morning" in there. And so it's a painting, it's a red painting with a black zip and a green zip. So I made a red one, I made a black one, and I made a green one. So I made a different painting that privileged a different color as the dominant color in the field for all of those paintings. And so they're all 8 by 18 feet. So they're all exactly the same size as the Barnett Newman. And they mean to perform all of the functions of the Barnett Newman, but add another layer. That's the black one. And then the green one. But that's a way in which the work sort of engages with art history too, and transform that art history so that it does something that you don't expect it, that those pictures do something you don't expect them to do. Now, let me speed up. So this is a group of portraits called the Stono Group. Now, for people who know something about American history and the Stono Rebellion in North Carolina, that'll mean something. So there are 4 of those. And then I really am going to go faster now. John Punch. So if you've read anything in American history, John Punch is also one of those figures around whom some important event in American history transpired, but there's no picture of John Punch for people to refer to. And so I make pictures of people who have that kind of presence in history, but of whom there's no image that you can latch onto. So that's a long story. Same thing with this one, David Walker. Anybody here know who David Walker is? So David Walker wrote a pamphlet in 1832, I think it was. It's called David Walker's Appeal to the Colored People of the World, and in particular those of the United States of America. And what the pamphlet was a critique of the Declaration of Independence as a hypocritical document, and an explanation of the condition of black people in America, in different chapters, the wretchedness of the black Negro in the United States on the account of all of these different things. It's broken up into sections. And he actually had written that pamphlet and was trying to smuggle it into the South as a way of raising slave rebellions, raising slave insurrections. And so that's who David Walker is. He turned up dead on his doorstep one day under mysterious circumstances. Then I have a picture of portrait of Nat Turner with the head of his master alongside a Caravaggio David. But anyway, but you get to see how the work, the variety, so there's a kind of variety of approaches to the work that I do, but also the way in which the works engage with various parts of history, art history, American history, black history, cultural history. It's all of those things are components of the things that I do. And each one of those things, and this is Charles White. So this is one of those artists. This was such an important figure for me when I was growing up as a child. And he was the reason why I went to the Otis Art Institute in the first place, when I found out he was a living human being and that he taught there. Because before I had read about him in a book called Great Negroes Past and Present. And so I thought, well, since this is a history book, of course, like people who are in history books are dead people. But I had a drawing class at Otis, and the teacher that taught that class showed us some images from a book called Images of Dignity, the drawings of Charles White, and told us that he had a studio upstairs. He took us upstairs to the studio to show us what the work was doing, and that was it. That opened up everything, because what I saw in that studio was work that was finished and work that was just beginning. And so I understood at that moment that the work that an artist did was a process. That pictures don't just happen, people make them. And that process of making a picture is hard work. And these are works by his, but this is that thing where I'm thinking, so I love some of these works. How come I don't ever see Charles White's work in the American art books? Is there something wrong with the work he did? Is it not good enough? Is he not a good drawer? It's that confusion. You have to find an answer for that. But the way there are all kinds of things that motivate things that I do. So this was a great book. I picked up this book on the Great American Pinup, and it's full of pictures like that picture. But it's when you experience this kind of absence of your presence in a kind of domain in which the image of desire is being created and projected, well, you got to have something for that. You got to have something for that. And so at some point, and then until, this is Lupita Nyong'o from 12 Years a Slave. And now, if you read the narrative, the Solomon Northup's narrative, that 12 Years a Slave was based on, you will also get some idea of why. So if you take that image, you take Lupita Nyong'o with Kenyan, and the woman in the next picture who is Nigerian. And I pulled that ad out of a British Airways magazine when I was flying back from London. And I'm struck by in the text of that, it talks about this company being a fashion company that is dedicated to the idea of the West African woman. And when I see something like that, this is not the image of the West African woman that comes to mind when I first see that. When I think of the West African woman, I'm thinking of somebody that looks a little bit more like Lupita Nyong'o. But the fact that this sort of lightness and complexion has become a thing that's prevalent even in a lot of African countries where skin lighteners and stuff like that are a big market, this is something that you got to kind of come to terms with what the implications of that are. And so the implications of that have something to do with the kinds of images that I make too. So if that's it, and then you have an article like this was from the Drum magazine where sort of the skin lightening thing sort of gets out of control. And someone says, well, I got tired of being called ugly. It's nice to be, what is this, something about, there's something about her husband. Now I feel more beautiful. But these things have meaning, and they have implications for the way in which people see themselves in the world and the way you value yourself in the world, too. And then there's a radio program that comes on a Canadian radio show called Ideas. And one of them, they spent a show talking about this phenomena of people who have ethnic sort of characteristics trying to transform themselves so that they look more Caucasian or look more European, or that they're not saddled with the problems that are associated with not being a white person. And so there was this Chinese guy who was undergoing all of these surgeries to reduce the kind of Asianness in his face, because his family, they had moved to London, and he was the problems he had when he went to school when he was in London, and he thought the best way to kind of, so he was saying, I became as racist as the guys who I was running with, because it was the only way I could deflect attention from me, and do it, and it was by doing it to somebody else. And so he talked about how, there's a documentary about this whole thing, and so he talked about the way he treated Pakistanis and the way he was treating black people from the Caribbean and stuff like that while he was in London, because he was running with he wanted to be like these guys he was running with. And he started doing that, and I thought that statement from his father was really kind of interesting, so I put that slide in. And then his whole thing is like, the way he thought of it, it's like, okay, I see these surgeries as a facilitator. It makes me confident. The longer I live, the less racial overtones will hang over it. It's like, and then I'm going to go, so here we got comic book imagery. We got the kind of the action and fantasy movies and stuff like that. But it's like, there's no difference between these movies and the image of the 12 men who walked on the moon, really. Because every time you see a movie like this, it says something about who has the capacity to do certain kinds of things. Who makes magic, who trains dragons, who kills witches, who does all of that stuff. When you see those movies, that's how you know who does it, because you see it in the movies. And so if you don't even have, as a part of your own personal individual imagination, the capacity to project yourself into the space where you do those kinds of things, where you kill giants and stuff like that, then you have a really big problem. And so you take the John Carter on Mars. Who saw that movie? It was an awful movie. Awful movie. But the point of it is, so how does John Carter get to Mars? He's a Confederate soldier who gets transported to Mars, where he saves the good-looking people. He becomes like Superman when he gets there. And so it's like single-handedly, he's like he gets to drag down the giant monsters and all that kind of stuff. I mean, that means something. Whether we admit it or not, it means something. And when you grow up on comic books, And for the longest time, when you have Superman and Batman and the Flash and Hawkman and all of those figures, and none of those figures look anything at all like you, that tells you something also about who has the capacity to be super. But you don't notice it until somebody introduces into the comic book another kind of superhero. And when the Black Panther appeared in this Fantastic Four issue, all of a sudden it called attention to the fact that you didn't see those kinds of characters as superheroes before then. And so the answer to that is to do superheroes that can do those kinds of amazing things and that can achieve the same kind of status that characters that we already know. And so for a period, there were a couple of superheroes, but they never really caught on. So Luke Cage, Hero for Hire, Black Lightning, these were characters that were introduced into Marvel and into DC Comics in the 70s. They didn't really last long. They didn't quite catch on like Batman and stuff like that. And they certainly couldn't sustain an independent comic of their own. So some of them ended up in, sort of as a part of a team, where they got to be a part of the Justice League or something, or they got to be a part of the Avengers or something like that. But those two comics, when they first came on the market, they were drawn. There were a handful of black comic book artists who worked in Marvel and worked at DC, and both those were drawn by a black artist when they first started out. But because there's this absence, I started doing comics too. Because there is a problem that has to be solved there, and it's that problem of how the imaginary works, and who has the capacity to create characters that can perform these magical functions, but in a way that is as powerful as what any of the other characters that are operating in the magazines can do. And so I started this thing called Rhythm Master, which this is the very beginning of it. And oddly enough, it begins at the Art Museum, at the Art Institute of Chicago, which is that corridor, and was the African Art Corridor at the Art Institute of Chicago. So that's where it all starts. And it goes on, it's this epic struggle between tradition and modernity, really, and a love story on top of all of that. And that's sort of how, it's sort of set up. It's a girlfriend and a boyfriend who are fighting against each other, but they don't know it. One of them's using traditional kind of African powers, and the other one's using robotics and drones and technology and things like that. But they don't know that they're competing against each other. There's just this sense that there's a kind of gang war that's gone out of control, and nobody knows who's responsible for it. But it's them. They're the antagonist and the protagonist. And that's just an installation of a kind of lightbox series of those works that was at the museum in Antwerp. So now I'm speeding. But anyway, so you get to see, so this is the thing that I'm working on as a kind of ongoing project that at some point will be rendered as a graphic novel, and then ultimately it means to become an animated feature film. But with characters, like they're characters that are treated in ways that you just don't see them in comics anymore. So anyway, let me move. And then I told you I did a puppet performance where I made these puppets that were part of that Rhythm Master narrative. Then we did that project at the Wexner Center. And who was that? I was talking to somebody about this Sinufo figure that's at the LA County Art Museum, which was I saw it on that field trip I went on to the LA County Museum when I was in like 4th or 5th grade or something. I never saw anything like it in my life. It had a powerful effect on me. I never forgot it. So that's one of the figures in the whole thing, and this is one of the other puppets. So these are all as a part of that project, but ways in which you extend the project into a lot of other domains. It doesn't just have to be drawings, but you can make other things from it. So you can make a thing that has a long life and can be used for a lot of other reasons. And so in that project I did at the Wexner, I had 20 high school kids that we trained to operate these puppets in the Japanese bunraku style, where 3 people operate 1 puppet. So we trained them and paid them, did the whole thing, and had them. They narrated, and then I had Kahil El-Zabar, who was a percussionist in Chicago, who played the music live, while the performance happened. All of that. And then some random stuff, kind of woodcuts. But just to see, it's like the different kinds of ways you can approach a lot of things. And these are not like the collages that I got the review on. But this is a later part of a project. But anyway, and there was a Bearden project at the Studio Museum in Harlem where they asked to do a kind of work in a manner of something that kind of attribute to Romare Bearden. So that was my contribution to that show. But all of these, you see these different ways of approaching form and the representation of a figure. And this was actually a part of that pinups group of works. So is this in a way, and this is like with that Trump Lloyd piece of paper on there that says, prettiest girl in the whole wide world. And then figure Frankenstein and the Bride of Frankenstein. And these are big pictures, you know, they're 7 feet tall. You know, so I'm going to just show some stuff. And then maybe we'll have time for 2 or 3 questions maybe before you all want to run out of here. I'll tell you, this is the title of this is Scipio Moorhead, Portrait of Himself, circa 1776. And so somebody must know who Scipio Moorhead was. So the first African-American artist. And we only know about him because Phyllis Wheatley wrote a poem about him in her book, and that the image, the engraving at the frontispiece of that book was an image she said was made by this young man who was a slave on the Moorhead plantation named Scipio Moorhead. That's the only reason we know who he is. But anyway, so this idea of who paints is an issue. And so when you see paintings of people who make paintings, that also sort of fixes in your mind the sort of idea of who paints. It becomes normal to see people that look like that who make paintings, in paintings too. So anyway, I'm going to go through a few some more of those, and then there's sort of a group of paintings that are called, so these are 2 Fragonard paintings that are in the Frick collection. And so I did a group of works that were based on these Rococo, on the Rococo as a model. But it's a way of doing Rococo paintings without copying a Rococo painting. So taking the idea of what Rococo was and trying to make paintings that do what Rococo paintings do, but do something different. This group of pictures is kind of about that. And the Fragonard series is called The Progress of Love. And so making pictures that perform like these Rococo paintings do, but that situate the black figure at the center of that subject, that's an important thing to me. And this painting, which is also the Fragonard, The Swing, which is a really popular picture. And there are a lot of lewd implications to that, which we won't go into. But I made a version of this painting. And here I think is where it's important to sort of see how my approach to engaging with Fragonard and Rococo, as opposed to, if you go over to the 21C Hotel, you see there's some Yinka Shonibari pieces in there. And with the Yinka Shonibari, he did a piece that's based on this Fragonard too. And so what he did was actually recreate this tableau kind of in 3D and take that figure that's sitting in the swing and cut the head off and dress it in a fabric, a Dutch fabric that was imported into Africa that became known as an African fabric, in a way, as a way of talking about the way in which colonialism on some level had influences on what Africans know about themselves as Africans. So I don't make stuff like this. I don't take a picture and then cut the head off and put a black head on it. what I try to do is to understand what the implications of the picture and what the picture is trying to do. And then I make a work that does something that this picture does. And so I made a suite of 5 paintings that are called The Swing. And it's 5 paintings that constitute one painting. And it's 5 paintings that animate the process. And so this is the first one in a suite of 5. And so in a room where you see all 5 of them together, you see the painting go, it's like, oops, oh, that's the wrong button. But it goes, it's the way you swing that figure is a 360-degree rotation. And so that constitutes the swing without having to copy the Fragonard swing and make a picture that looks like it. So it's a picture that performs the function of a swing but doesn't look like the Fragonard painting. So that's my approach. And then so I went from those black and white paintings, sort of in grisaille with just a little bit of color, to the sort of rococo-ish kind of paintings, but in full color. So that's one, and then another. So anyway, an early collage called Yellow Quarters. Some more of these collage, just variety. So and I'm going to go through those quick. And then, so this brings us to, it's like a whole other group of pictures that are also about the way in which artworks function in the marketplace. So they're pictures that are about the artwork as a commodity, about the thing that wants to be bought and paid for. So that why pay more? Red hot deal. It's like, snap it up. Somebody. And there's one said low, low price. But you make paintings that sort of announce, their desire to be purchased. But that was a part of a group of works in which somebody was asking me about these coins. So this is a show, I did this show at Jack Shaman. That black painting says, on sale Black Friday. But it's, the way in which the idea of the painting as a commodity kind of circulates within the painting. But the coins on the floor are a sculpture piece called the 99-cent piece. And it's 99 cents and change. But with the quarter is 5 feet in diameter, and all of the coins are to scale. And then it's cast, and then coated with the brass surface. So it's like a gilded set of coins. But the whole thing about the way the work circulates in the marketplace, so it's called the 99-cent piece, but subtitled $136,000 in change. And it's that because it cost $136,000 to make that. And so what the idea of the work is the discrepancy between the representation of the cheapness of 99 cents and the cost of having to fabricate something that represents 99 cents. So that's the way in which you play around with the way in which these artworks sort of operate within a system of commodification, and also you play with the idea of what kinds of things constitute sculpture. You could throw an array of change on the floor, and that's sculpture too. So anyway, just a close-up. And then just back to from that show in Vienna. And then an installation thing, and I'm not going to say too much about those. But then we'll go through a couple of other things. The way in which you could take this is a 6 foot by 9 foot picture, but there's those over the sofa seascapes and stuff you get at the starving artist sale, the $39.99, nothing over $39.99 kind of pictures. And then there's this idea, there's a kind of genre called black art, where you go to some of these art festivals and art fairs, and there's this group of people, they call themselves black artists, and they make a certain kind of work that's a kind of positive image representation of black people. And for the most part, those artists never get any consideration in the critical conversations about what we think of as contemporary art and modern art, in part because the work is seen as being completely sentimental, uncritical, and sophomoric. And so for me, so when you, and that work is marginalized. So the way I take challenges up when I'm making work is say, well, if that's the problem with that work, then it's not sufficient to marginalize that work and just kind of dismiss it. What somebody should be trying to do is figure out how to resolve whatever the inadequacies in that work is and make it so that it can then function within this sort of mainstream critical art environment. Solve the problem. Don't dismiss the work, solve the problem. And for the artists who make that work, they need to solve that problem. And so when the Studio Museum in Harlem did an exhibition called The Black Romantic, they put out an open call, and anybody, all the people who used to complain about never being able to show in the Studio Museum in Harlem, they never got shows in the galleries downtown, it was open to all those people who wanted to apply and submit work, and it would come in unjudged. But I thought one of the reasons why they did that show was to, in some ways, to silence those people and to get them to stop asking for an opportunity to show in the museum. Because if you put that work in there and then the critics just ripped it to shreds, then they would know better than to come asking again. But instead, some of those critics said, you know what? Some of this stuff looks all right. But the thing is, I tried to make work that was like that work, but that you took seriously. So anyway, and then some earlier stuff. But you see these, just so we can get to some other things. In this picture and this picture, somebody asked me once, where was the turning point for me? These two pictures, that picture and the picture before it, that was a major turning point for me. Because this was the moment when I finally said to myself, now I've made the kind of picture that I'd always imagined myself being able to make. When I made this picture and this picture. This is called The Lost Boys, and this other picture is called This Style. And this picture, this is the picture that was purchased from that exhibition by the LA County Art Museum. That was the first major museum purchase of a work of mine, and it was significant because the LA County Art Museum was the first art museum I had ever been in. And that was the museum where I said, one of these days I want a work of mine in this museum so that it sits there among all this other stuff that's in the museum. That was my goal. And when that painting arrived at the LA County Art Museum, I had fulfilled all of my ambition up to that point. That was my goal. I was in there. And not only was I in there, but I was in there in a way that you couldn't miss it, you couldn't overlook it, you couldn't pass by it without knowing it was there. Because that's like 10 foot by 11 foot. You're not likely to get by without noticing that you saw that. But the thing that's most important about a picture like this for me, and the way that picture arrived in the museum, is that I'm over at the 21C hotel, and there's some Kehinde Wiley pictures in the lobby. And when Kehinde Wiley says, when I saw that picture at the LA County Art Museum, I knew a lot of things were possible for me. That's what it's, in a lot of ways, that's really what it's all about. I mean, if it seems to open up possibilities for somebody else to think that they can now do that too, that's really what it's all about. And especially if it's another younger artist who sort of finds in that work a way through or a way up to some level that they want to achieve. And so for me, that means everything. So anyway, and this is down in the Birmingham Museum now, but it's that way in which, so you can see, if you've been to London, to the National Gallery in London, you know they have that Hans Holbein painting called The Ambassadors. And there's that anamorphic feature in that painting. There's this weird shape down at the bottom, but when you look at it from the side, you see it's a skull that only comes together when you look at it at a certain angle. So there's this, that sort of at least addresses some part of that, but then there are other things about a picture in a space like this. But I had always wanted to make a companion piece to the male barbershop thing that was a female beauty shop. And it took me a long time to get around to it, but I finally did it, in 2012. And this is the companion to the style painting. And it's called School of Beauty, School of Culture. So anyway, and we're leading up to the Our Town painting. But anyway, I'm going to show these fast. Scouts, that's the whole array. Boy Scout, Girl Scout, Cub Scout, Brownie, Thin Mother, and Scoutmaster. And then a group of things called the Garden Project. But where you see it's like the way in which those pictures are painted, and these are more like the Our Town painting, because that was of a moment when I was making paintings that functioned like that and that had a lot of those sort of artifacts of modernist painting and these gestural kinds of marks and things on it. So anyway, Bang and Our Town. Pastimes. And then I did a great big giant woodcut. That thing's 48 feet long. And then these Beatrice. So this is a group of paintings based on the way we commemorate the civil rights movement and the black liberation struggle. So anyway, I'll go through those quickly. Big pictures, though. Big pictures. This one is at the Whitney, actually, in New York. And then there's this is in Nelson Atkins in Kansas City. And then there was this group of smaller pictures that went with those. But then I also made a lot of objects, too, that also have a relationship to history. And so this is a piece. The piece is called As Seen on TV. And it's a small replica of the sign on 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, as a commemorative souvenir vase with artificial flowers and a photograph of a TV commercial and all that stuff. And then a photographic piece called Heirlooms and Accessories. It's a triptych. There's a lot that can be said about it, but I'm going to move on. Another photograph based on the Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, and John Kennedy, but in these souvenirs that proliferated after the assassination of those three. And this is from an ink pen that was given out at a Ford dealership in Chicago in 1970. They had the photograph in that acrylic section. More stuff. I'm going to keep going because I'm running out of time. There's people from here from Austin, Texas. So at the Blanton, that picture is at the Blanton. So and then a series of photographs. But all of these things, so from the photographs, so this is a series, it's called Black Artist Studio View. A photograph called Black Christmas. And I did a series of portraits. This is of an actress who lives in Chicago named Tyler. That's my wife, Cheryl, who's also an actress. But you can see how a picture like that kind of dovetails with the Manet, and so this is the last photograph. But the thing about these pictures, so the question ends up being, well, why do those pictures look the way they look? And a part of the reason why those pictures look the way they look is because a part of the function of these pictures is to ask a question about the nature of photography. So then what determines what a photographic image looks like? Well, in a lot of ways, the quality of the light that makes the photograph determines what the photograph is going to look like. And if you take a photograph under ultraviolet light, which these photographs are all taken under ultraviolet light, and ultraviolet light is also known as black light. So it has implications about taking pictures in the dark, which means on some level it goes back all the way to the Ralph Ellison Invisible Man, where you have a picture or image that is present and absent, where you're taking pictures in a suboptical kind of conditions where it's where all of the information that you would get if you photographed that image under white light is not available to you, because only certain kinds of colors register in the spectrum under ultraviolet light. And ultraviolet light is at the least visible end of the color spectrum. So that's where invisibility resides. And so that's a part of what these works are trying to do. And so the reason why those photographs all have that color is because of the quality of the light that makes the photograph. And those things are important to me, you know, as a way of exploring the ways in which images, the many ways in which images can look. Anyway, I'll stop with that. So that picture is a photograph of the Ebony and the Johnson's Publishing building in Chicago, where they published Ebony magazine and Jet magazine. So taken one night from Lakeshore Drive. So you only see the light on those buildings there, and you see that Ebony and Jet in a black field. And so that's, you know, as they say, well, that's my story. And I'm sticking to it. Thank you.
I was wondering, at what age did you think, you know, this is something I could really do. I could be an artist full-time, and this could be my life. Because I think that's a spectacular thing for anybody to think. And being born in 1955 in Birmingham, it seems particularly spectacular.
Well, you know, the truth is, I never thought it. I never thought I was going to make any money, make a living making art. And as a consequence of thinking, you know what? This is also one of the pitfalls of going to the library and reading stuff. And so, you know, you read these narratives. So of course I read the Van Gogh narrative, you know, where it's like all of those artists who Van Gogh never sold a picture in his life. If it wasn't for his brother supporting him, there was no way he could have survived. I mean, the number of artists who we know sort of went through their careers with no recognition, and sort of after their death, they sort of ended up being kind of acknowledged as having made some contribution. I believed that. And so because I thought I was never going to be able to make a living as an artist, I did crazy things, I guess. Like trying to make sure there was no way I would be unable to produce artworks because I couldn't afford to buy art material. And so I found a book at the library called The Craft of Old Master Drawing. And in it had the formulas for how to make ink, how to make crayons, and all those things. And so you could make ink out of soot from the chimney. So I tried to make ink out of soot from the chimney. I learned how to cut goose quill pins. I tried to do it out of pigeon feathers. I made recycled paper by grinding up phone books in a blender. I did all that stuff because I said, these are the ways, it's like, if I can do these things, I will never be without art material, so I would never have to stop making artwork because I couldn't afford to buy materials, because I thought there was going to be a time when I wouldn't be able to afford to buy material. That just was what it meant to be an artist. And I believed it. And so I was fully prepared to have to work on a job and just do my artwork, you know, kind of on the side. I never expected to make a single dollar, because I didn't have a model for that. I never saw anybody do it. And when Charles White, I met at Otis, I mean, he was teaching like a lot of artists were teaching because, you know, it was harder to make a living by selling artworks. And he had said, well, you know what? It's like he said you would never make enough money selling your artwork to live on. And so I fully expected that to be the way it went. And we were talking at dinner the other night, I mean, it really, you can see if for the people who were going to look for this film that Robert Hughes did, you can see how with artists like Barnett Newman and Jasper Johns, those guys, I mean, this whole idea of being able to have a career as an artist as soon as you get out of college, I mean, that was completely insane. Nobody thought like that. They didn't have their first shows, some of them, until they were in their 40s. And so there was no model for a living as an artist, you know. And then it's like, I remember sitting with my father once. We were watching the news on Channel 7 when I was in LA, and it was that first year when Jasper Johns' painting sold at auction for $1 million, the highest price ever paid for a work by a living artist. And my father turned to me once and said, Kerry, when are you going to sell a picture for $1 million?
Okay, we got one more question over here.
Okay.
Well, hello.
Hi.
I am Jasmine Hudson, and thank you so much for your lecture. I'm here with my really good friend, Jay, who's a very passionate artist, especially as it relates to African-American depictions, particularly to the youth. And I wanted you to speak to mentorship, how to establish mentorship relationships, cultivate them, and ultimately optimize upon them so that you can become a better artist.
How to do that?
Yes.
Show up.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, really, show up and I mean, literally, you just be there. I mean, if you're always on the scene, if there's an artist you admire, you know, they are actually surprisingly approachable. So, I tell the story when I slipped into Charles White's class, and I hid in the back, in the corner, for a lot of reasons. One reason is there was a naked lady on the stand up there in front of the class. And you know, and you know that thing if you're scared to look. So you can't even make a drawing because you're scared to be seen looking. When you're a kid, you think like that. So I hid in the back, and he came over, he saw me back there, and he literally said to me, you can't see anything from back there. Come up here on the front row where you can see. And literally, and that's how it started. And so and when if you go to talk to people and you tell them what you want to do, they are more than happy to talk to you. That's how it starts. I can't tell you how many people I'm in touch with by email and stuff who are sending me images to look at and to talk about and to ask questions about. All the time. I give out my email all the time because because I think this is what it takes. You know, you got to be available for anybody who thinks they want to do it. But you also, I think you have an obligation to tell them what it's really like, what it's really about. Because it's not I mean, there's no magic in this. There's no magic. And you really got to, I mean, if you want to do it, there's a way to get there. But you got to hear the right thing, which means all this stuff that I'm talking about its relationship to art history and stuff like that, and how you use artwork as a kind of scientific tool to investigate. You're just using representation as a tool to investigate certain things. I mean, if you approach it that way, you'll be in that position that I talked about. You'll have the better than 50-50 chance. Because you got to have a better, don't go out if you don't think you have a better than 50% chance of winning. Are you gambling? I love gambling. I used to go to Atlantic City and Las Vegas. And you learn things when you sit down at the blackjack table. So,
well,
anyway.
Kerry James Marshall, I want to thank you so much for celebrating our anniversary week. Thank you.
Thank you for having me here.